The early years went well between the Cayuse and the Whitmans. The medicine was a hard point, though. If the Cayuse didn't like their own medicine man and he didn't heal them, they would kill him. And there were many men who they took a risk in trying to heal, and one of them was Chief Sitkis. Chief Sitkis later was one of the people who warned Whitman that there were bad-hearted Indians, and he also helped lead the Great Migration over the Rockies. During 1842, Marcus went back east to help save the mission with the board. However, at the same time, he was considered almost a booster for Oregon and Washington, and opening up the road for the Oregon Trail. He also talked to people in Washington and newspaper reporters and brought back his nephew, Perrin Whitman. Marcus Whitman knew that the mission would be important to the Oregon Trail, and it was. Dr. Elijah White actually accused him at one time of taking advantage of the people coming over the mountain, but Whitman actually gave much of his time and kindness and food, sometimes had to borrow food from the Spaldings to make it through a winter because he had given his or sold most of his away. This was actually settled between them in Oregon City. 1843 to 1847 proved a difficult time. Catholic priests arrived in 1839 at Walla Walla, and their friend Dr. McLaughlin converted to Catholicism in 1842. The Indians became a bit confused over this, as well as Joe Lewis, a mixed breed, began telling the Indians that Dr. Whitman was poisoning them. In early 1847, the measles hit, and over half of the Cayuse Indians died, as well as many of the whites, but many of them were surviving, which confused the Indians. A few of the disgruntled Cayuse Indians began the massacre. It did not start as this picture portrays, but a tomahawk was used on Mr. Whitman that looked like this, only Whitman was killed outside of his home. The Cayuse Indian Tillakukite, who had been very familiar with the Whitmans earlier, was one of the chiefs that helped in the massacre. 14 adults, including 2 of the older Sager boys, were killed that day. The massacre happened on November 29, 1847. A few people escaped, but most were taken captive. It was Peter Skeen Ogden and a party of 16 men who brought a ransom for the survivors. They were from the Hudson Bay Company and exchanged blankets, shirts, tobacco, muskets, flints, and several hundred musket balls for the 47 survivors. After the survivors were safely in the Walla Walla Valley, 500 volunteers went after the Cayuse and began the first Indian War of the Pacific Northwest. The Cayuse turned over 5 people that they felt was responsible for the massacre, including Tillakukite and Tomahas. It was Joseph Meek, United States Marshal, former trapper, and father of Helen Mar Meek, who died at the Whitman Mission just a few days after the massacre from measles, who helped hang the 5. Survivors would continue to tell their stories throughout the years, and the mound that was placed over the graves would be visited for many years to come. Eventually, a national park would be created and monuments would be built to the Whitmans. Marcus Whitman would carry on the name of Whitman Seminary, which later became Whitman College, and the park would continue to tell the history and the story of the martyrs that lived beyond that time. The Cayuse Indians are hardly ever heard of after this time, as they become a smaller group. Part of the Walla Walla and Umatilla tribes, you can still visit the national park today and see many of the monuments and read many of the stories left behind by the survivors.